In the early 1970s, a quiet revolution was brewing. Visionaries at Xerox PARC, a cutting-edge research lab, were reimagining the future of computing. Their groundbreaking work led to the creation of the Xerox Alto, the first computer with a graphical user interface. It was a glimpse into a future where computers could be intuitive, visual, and accessible to everyone. However, before Xerox could capitalize on their invention, a fierce war broke out between companies like IBM, Apple, and Microsoft, a war for dominance in the burgeoning desktop operating system market. It's a tale of how Microsoft rose to dominate the desktop OS market, crushing competitors like CP/M and OS/2. We will see why no matter how innovative and forward-thinking you are, strategy, tactics, and sheer ruthlessness is what ultimately wins the day. This is the story of how Microsoft built an empire and why its monopoly remains unchallenged to this day, leaving the world with the unusually cruel punishment of having to use the Windows operating system. In the early 1970s, computing was dominated by large mainframes, the size of entire rooms. They were practically unusable for non-technical average users. But times were changing. A growing number of visionaries began realizing that computers could be dramatically reduced in size and be useful to the average person. A group of these visionaries were employees of Xerox PARC, a well-funded research facility that had been established by what was then one of the most profitable companies in America, Xerox. Xerox at the time had a highly profitable photocopier business. Its leadership feared that its photocopier monopoly wouldn't last forever, so it decided to set up a research lab to explore other technologies that Xerox could commercialize. The scientists and researchers at Xerox PARC were tasked with reimagining the future of the office. Essentially, they were tasked with building technologies that would complement Xerox photocopier business. But Xerox PARC's employees were given enough freedom to largely pursue pretty much any technological innovation they could imagine. It was this freedom, coupled with the concentration of some of the brightest technologists of the early 70s, that led to the revolutionary creation of the graphical user interface-based personal computer, the Xerox Alto. The Xerox Alto was created in 1973, and along with it being the first graphical user interface-based computer in the world, it also featured one of the earliest personal computing operating systems, which was Xerox Alto OS. For its time, this operating system was revolutionary. It allowed users to interact with the computer visually, making it far more intuitive. Simply put, the operating system was 10 years ahead of its time. The huge leap in software advancements that the operating system presented is exactly why it ran on prohibitively expensive hardware. The Alto used state-of-the-art hardware, and each unit reportedly cost more than $32,000. Equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars today, making it accessible only to research institutions and large corporations. Apart from the prohibitive cost of the Alto, Xerox itself failed to recognize the potential market for personal computers. Its corporate leadership had changed, and the new regime was more short-term focused, prioritizing making the photocopier business more profitable. By the early 80s, it was clear to everyone that there was huge potential in the personal computing business. Apple had released its massively popular Apple II computer, which by 1980 had sold over 100,000 units. The immense potential of the personal computing market was so attractive that it prompted the entrance of the industry giant IBM, who released their first PC in 1981. It was only then that Xerox decided to commercialize his GUI technology and computer hardware advancements, but it was too late and way too expensive. In a world where there was a growing number of personal computers priced at below $2,000, the Xerox Star, priced at above $15,000, was far out of the reach of the average consumer. Sure, it featured a graphical user interface, but personal computers were still new. Most people had no idea what they were and how they would use one. Killer applications like VisiCalc on the Apple II were the primary reasons that consumers bought computers. The operating system itself was not really a consideration. What was important for computer sales in the early 80s were the applications that could be run on the computers. So the Xerox Star would end up not making a dent in the personal computing market, and the early computing market would come to be dominated by MS-DOS and CP/M operating systems. CP/M by the early 80s had become one of the most popular operating systems for personal computers and was the first commercial operating system for personal computers ever created. In the early 1970s, Gary Kildall was a computer scientist who worked for the US Navy. A colleague of him showed him the latest Intel chip. Using this chip, Kildall put together a computer that was the size of a briefcase. He showed off the machine to his colleagues and fellow enthusiasts who were very impressed by it. Among those who were impressed was Intel, so much so that they hired Kildall as a part-time software consultant. Intel was developing newer and more sophisticated chips which Kildall tinkered with. He managed to figure out a way to use the chips to store data and created the world's first disk operating system, which he called CP/M. Initially, Gary Kildall tried to sell the operating system to Intel and get them to commercialize it, but Intel wasn't interested. Kildall had no interest in going into business, but his wife, Dorothy Kildall, motivated him to start a business around the operating system. So Kildall, along with his wife, incorporated a company called Digital Research. The new company began licensing copies of the CP/M operating system to computer vendors in the rapidly growing microcomputer industry. By 1980, they had sold over 500,000 copies of the CP/M operating system, which was by far the most popular on the market. So it was only logical for IBM to approach Gary Kildall to write the operating system for their upcoming personal computer. Initially, IBM reached out to Bill Gates. This was because Microsoft was a well-known software company, but at the time, when IBM approached Bill Gates, they hadn't developed an operating system. So Bill Gates recommended IBM to go to the headquarters of Digital Research, whose CP/M operating system was then the most popular OS for personal computers. Bill Gates called Gary Kildall to let him know that there were some very important people who were coming by. IBM had made Bill Gates sign a strict NDA, so he couldn't directly tell Kildall that the people coming by were IBM. When IBM showed up at the headquarters of Digital Research, which was Gary Kildall's house, things didn't unfold as expected. Depending on who's telling the story, there are two versions of events that supposedly happened that day. The first version, which is claimed to be the truth by IBM and Bill Gates, states when IBM arrived, they found Kildall's wife, Dorothy, who was the business manager, so they tried to convince Dorothy to sign their strict NDA, but she refused, and so with no agreement in place, the frustrated IBM executives left. But in Gary Kildall's unpublished memoir, he claims that he met IBM on that fateful day, and he arrived late, and yes, his wife had refused to sign the NDA, but Gary convinced her to sign it. Gary wanted IBM to agree to the same $10 per copy royalty for CP/M as was paid by all its other customers. According to Kildall, on that day, no agreement was reached, but promises were made to reconvene negotiations at a later date. So as the story goes, IBM went back to Bill Gates to ask him if he couldn't build them an operating system. Gates, not one to pass up an opportunity twice, told IBM that he would build them an operating system. Microsoft, however, did not build IBM an operating system from the ground up. They chose to buy one. Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, knew of someone who had created an operating system that worked exactly the same as CP/M. The man behind the OS was Tim Patterson, who worked at Seattle Computer Products. He had built an operating system that could do everything that CP/M could. Patterson called his operating system the Quick and Dirty Operating System, or QDOS for short. It was renamed PC-DOS after Microsoft bought it and was licensed to IBM by Microsoft. When Kildall saw the pre-release version of PC-DOS running on an IBM computer, he thought it looked extremely similar to CP/M. Gary Kildall threatened to sue IBM, who swiftly dispatched lawyers to speak to Kildall. IBM didn't want anything to mess up the release of their upcoming PC, so they opted to cut a deal with Kildall, a deal they hoped was good enough to prevent Kildall from suing them. At the launch of the new IBM computer, IBM offered to sell an IBM-compatible version of CP/M alongside PC-DOS. This set the stage for a titanic clash between PC-DOS and CP/M. It was expected, due to its sheer popularity, that consumers would choose CP/M over PC-DOS as their operating system of choice for the IBM computers. When the IBM computer was released, PC-DOS was priced at $40 a copy, while CP/M was priced at $240, 6 times the price of PC-DOS. As a result of the huge price difference, PC-DOS became the most popular operating system for the IBM PC, and due to the popularity of the IBM PC, it heavily cut into the market share of CP/M. Before the introduction of PC-DOS in 1981, CP/M had a near monopoly on the personal computer operating system market, commanding over 90% of it. However, by the end of 1982, it had dropped to 70%, with Microsoft's desktop operating system commanding a 20% share of the OS market. These OS wars were not simply a two-horse race. There was a third important player in the OS wars who had a small market share in the OS market but had come to become one of the most valuable computer companies in the world. In 1975, a young Steve Jobs came across a side project his friend had been working on. It was a computer of sorts, and it immediately piqued Steve Jobs' interest. He showcased the project along with his friend Steve Wozniak at a local computer club. The project was well received, to the point where people started inquiring about how they could buy one of their own. Steve Jobs immediately saw a business opportunity and founded Apple Computers with Steve Wozniak, along with a third co-founder. Their first product, which was essentially just a motherboard, was moderately successful, but the co-founders soon realized that more people would buy their product if it came fully assembled out of the box. Motherboards appealed to hobbyists and technical folks, but were out of the technical reach of the average consumer. But the average consumer was still interested in buying a computer. So with this realization, the boys released the Apple II in 1977. Apple would release the Apple Disk operating system soon after, which dramatically revolutionized the Apple II's capabilities, catapulting it to the top of the most popular PCs of the late 70s and early 80s. By 1982, over 1.5 million units of the machine had been sold. This solidified Apple DOS as the third most popular desktop operating system, commanding a sizable market share of about 10%. Entering into 1983, massive shifts were happening in the operating system market, and a fierce battle for the #1 position was in full motion. The surge in market share of PC-DOS wasn't purely based on the popularity of the IBM PC. When IBM struck a deal with Microsoft to develop an operating system for the upcoming PC, Microsoft cleverly negotiated permission to allow them to license the very same operating system they licensed to IBM to other computer manufacturers. The OS they licensed to other PC makers was called MS-DOS and was practically identical to PC-DOS. It ran all the same programs. IBM was known as a giant of the computer industry, so when they decided to enter the personal computing market, it was almost guaranteed that they were going to have massive success. Indeed, that is exactly what happened. By the end of 1983, over 1.3 million IBM PCs had been sold. IBM had set the standard for what a PC was. Other PC makers saw this and immediately went to work trying to build IBM clones. Because most people associated the IBM PC as the standard for what a PC was, a plethora of PC vendors now had to market their PCs as better or cheaper versions of the IBM PC to be able to tap into the new market that IBM had just created. The essential component in building the perfect IBM PC clone would be its operating system. The hardware of the computer didn't matter if it couldn't run the same software as IBM's PC, so Microsoft began licensing MS-DOS to the eager PC makers who were gunning to take market share away from IBM's PC. In these intensifying PC wars, Microsoft was emerging as the winner. By the end of 1984, Microsoft had successfully dethroned CP/M as the most popular desktop operating system in the world. MS-DOS commanded 50% of the OS market, while CP/M had declined to about 15%, with Apple's operating system at about 18% of the desktop OS market share. But Apple's desktop OS market share was now split. It wasn't simply comprised of Apple DOS, but it included its newly released Macintosh system software. In 1983, Apple decided to turn the entire computing world on its head. Borrowing from the innovations at Xerox PARC, they released the Apple Lisa and later the Macintosh in 1984. While the Lisa wasn't much of a success due to its incredibly high price, the Macintosh, which launched at a cheaper price, was quite successful. What distinguished the Macintosh and the Lisa from all other computers was the fact that they were the very first personal computers to feature a graphical user interface. They completely altered the perception of what a computer was and what it was capable of doing. Multitasking was seamless as users could switch between windows, drag and drop objects on the screen, and easily resize application windows. By the end of 1985, over 500,000 Macintoshes had been sold. By 1985, the desktop operating system market looked like this. Microsoft was in pole position with a market share of about 65%, followed by Apple's DOS and macOS, which together held a 20% market share, and CP/M in third place with a market share of about 5%, a rapid decline from the 90% it held in 1981. The main reason for CP/M's decline was its failure to quickly transition to 16-bit systems. CP/M was originally designed for 8-bit microcomputers, which dominated the late 70s. However, as the market shifted to more powerful 16-bit systems in the early 1980s, CP/M was slow to adapt. Digital Research released CP/M86, a 16-bit version in 1981, but by then it was too late. MS-DOS had become the industry standard due to IBM's PC standardizing PC-DOS. CP/M rapidly lost ground and would never catch up, ultimately fading into irrelevance by the late 80s. Other operating systems had also begun to command a small but sizable market share of the operating system market. These included PC makers that shipped their PCs with their own operating system. Among these were Commodore. Commodore was one of the earliest companies to make a personal computer, releasing the Commodore PET in 1977. The PET was followed up by the VIC-20, which was released in 1980 and became the first personal computer to reach 1 million units sold. But its blockbuster release, a machine that stands as one of the most commercially successful PCs ever made, would be released in 1982, and that was the Commodore 64. The C64 would go on to sell between 15 and 30 million units during its lifetime and would go on to be recognized as the best-selling PC of all time. This catapulted Commodore to having the fourth most popular operating system in 1984 behind Microsoft, Apple, and CP/M. But 1984 would prove to be the peak of Commodore's desktop OS market share, as in the years following it would experience a rapid decline. Its rapid decline would mostly stem from its management issues. Its chairman and major shareholder, Irving Gould, frequently butted heads with Commodore founder and CEO Jack Tramiel. In September 1984, their relationship reached a breaking point when Jack Tramiel complained about how Irving Gould was using company resources as his own. Jack strongly believed that the company resources should not be used for personal use and gave Gould an ultimatum. If Gould was to continue using company resources for non-company affairs, he would leave, and Gould responded by telling him to leave. Jack left Commodore that day and never returned. Without its visionary founder at the helm, Commodore rapidly lost ground to IBM and its many clones that were running MS-DOS. They purchased a company called Amiga, which itself had come to have a respectable 2% of the desktop OS market share. But its acquisition would ultimately not be enough to save Commodore. Despite how advanced the Commodore Amiga was, it just fell victim to the terrible management of the company by its majority shareholder, Irving Gould. Other minor players included Atari with its operating system, which ran on the Atari ST series of computers, achieving single-digit market share percentages. But throughout the early and mid-80s, nothing came close to dethroning Microsoft's MS-DOS. But Microsoft was wary that the tides could change at any moment, so they knew they had to work on creating a next-generation operating system to help sustain its market dominance. When Microsoft saw Apple's Graphical User Interface, they were shocked. It was years ahead of their popular MS-DOS OS, which was a command-line based operating system. MS-DOS was quite difficult for the average person to use, as they would have to memorize a ton of command-line prompts to be able to get stuff done. Meanwhile, Apple's GUI replaced the same processes with simply moving a mouse and clicking on the specific part of the screen where you wanted to perform an action. It was leaps and bounds better in terms of user-friendliness, and Bill Gates and Microsoft knew this. They knew that graphical user interface based operating systems were going to be the future of personal computing, so they went to work creating their own GUI based OS. They called it Windows, and its first version would launch in 1985, but Windows 1.0 wasn't as revolutionary as the Macintosh GUI. Windows 1.0 was not really a fully fledged operating system. It acted more like a graphical overlay that ran on top of MS-DOS. It lacked many features that users expected from a GUI, such as overlapping windows. Add to that the fact that many PCs at the time did not have the hardware required to run Windows 1.0 effectively. The system was slow and resource intensive, even on capable machines. There were few third-party applications available for Windows 1.0, limiting its appeal to users. Most software at the time was still designed for MS-DOS. Microsoft sold approximately 500,000 copies of Windows 1.0 during its lifetime between 1985 and 1987, which wouldn't seem bad until you compare it to the 10 to 15 million copies of MS-DOS they sold during the same period. IBM's first PC was built with off-the-shelf hardware that any other PC manufacturer could also get. This was done to prioritize speed because IBM was eager to enter the PC market as fast as possible, but this also meant it was very easy to build an IBM PC clone. To further add fuel to the fire, the agreement they had with Microsoft allowed them to license the very same operating system they had licensed to IBM to other manufacturers. Because of this, nearly identical clones began to spring up that challenged IBM. IBM was beginning to lose its lead in the PC wars and realized that the design of the first IBM PC was a huge mistake. So for its next line of computers, IBM changed its strategy. It renegotiated terms with Microsoft and created a joint development agreement. This agreement was for Microsoft and IBM to collaborate on developing a new operating system called OS/2. OS/2 was going to be proprietary and Microsoft could not license it to anyone else. It was solely built for IBM and its computers. OS/2 came out in late 1987 and it was a total disaster. IBM, in trying to create their own operating system, forgot one thing: the applications. Because this was IBM's own operating system, existing popular software applications built for DOS were not compatible with OS/2. The main reason why people were buying computers at the time was because of the applications, like spreadsheets and word processors. A lot of these popular applications were not compatible with IBM's new OS/2. For the first time in the PC wars, consumers began thinking twice about purchasing an IBM PC as a no-brainer industry standard choice. Consumers began buying other PCs that were compatible with popular applications. By 1990, the partnership between Microsoft and IBM had effectively ended. Microsoft shifted its focus entirely to Windows, while IBM continued to develop OS/2 on its own. Despite IBM's efforts, OS/2 failed to gain significant market share. It was seen as expensive, resource-intensive, and lacking the software support that Windows enjoyed. By the mid-1990s, OS/2 had become a niche product, primarily used in specific enterprise environments. Microsoft capitalized on IBM's poor execution. While Microsoft was working with IBM on OS/2, they were simultaneously working on the next release of Windows, Windows 2.0. Windows 2.0 was released in the same year as OS/2's first version, in 1987. It was a significant improvement over Windows 1.0. Windows 2.0 introduced overlapping windows, making it more user-friendly. It sold nearly 2 million copies during its lifetime between 1987 and 1990, but its sales figures were still relatively unimpressive when compared to MS-DOS sales, which were over 20 million copies during the same period. The real blockbuster success for Microsoft's TUI ambitions would come with the release of Windows 3.0. Windows 3.0 was launched in 1990 and it introduced a more polished and user-friendly graphical user interface compared to its predecessors. Windows 3.0 supported a wide range of software applications, including popular productivity tools like Microsoft Word and Excel. This made it a viable platform for both home and business use. The introduction of the software development kit for Windows 3.0 encouraged developers to create applications for the platform. This led to a growing ecosystem of software that further drove adoption. Windows 3.0 was a massive commercial success, selling over 10 million copies within 2 years of its release. The combination of Windows 3.0 and MS-DOS had given Microsoft a massive 75% share of the desktop OS market and gave Microsoft a near monopoly on operating systems for personal computers. Microsoft, however, did not simply reach this position through innovation and smart business strategy. It also engaged in some of the most cutthroat and unethical business tactics to kill its competitors. Microsoft forced PC manufacturers like IBM, Compaq, and Dell to sign contracts where they had to pay Microsoft a fee for every PC they sold. Not simply every PC that ran Microsoft's operating systems, but every PC period. This made it financially impractical for PC manufacturers to install alternative operating systems since they had to pay for MS-DOS regardless. This effectively killed off competition by making rival OS options economically not viable for personal computer manufacturers. Microsoft also threatened PC retailers who sold computers with alternative operating systems. It told retailers that they could lose access to Windows licenses if they sold or promoted other OS options. Many retailers stopped stocking alternative OSs. Microsoft also pressured software developers to only develop applications for Windows, discouraging multi-platform support. If developers didn't follow suit, Microsoft would threaten to cut off access to their key development tools. Because of this, software developers focused on Windows, and Microsoft built an applications monopoly. Microsoft would go on to solidify its immense dominance over the desktop operating system market with the release of Windows 95 and Windows 98. Windows 95 launched August 24, 1995, and it was a crucial turning point in the desktop operating system wars. Microsoft spent $300 million on marketing the operating system, making it one of the most heavily advertised software launches in history. Windows 95 was designed to run on a wide range of hardware, from low-end PCs to high-end systems. This broad compatibility helped it quickly gain market share. Many of the features introduced in Windows 95, such as the Start menu, taskbar, and plug-and-play, became staples of the Windows operating system. Windows 95 sold over 7 million copies in the first 5 weeks and became the most widely used operating system of its time. By the end of 1996, Microsoft and its various operating systems held an 80% share of the desktop OS market, a share that would grow with the release of Windows 98. Windows was more stable than Windows 95, with fewer crashes and better memory management. This made it a more reliable choice for everyday users. Windows 98 was a smashing commercial success, selling over 15 million copies in its first 6 months. It became one of the best-selling versions of Windows at the time. By the end of 1999, the OS wars were all but over. Microsoft held over 90% of the desktop OS market share and had built itself a monopoly in the desktop OS market, a monopoly it unfortunately continues to hold until this very day.